Hello everyone, I'm RV Micah and welcome to the show where I won't kill any of my guests as long as they've got a dime left in their pocket. Last month I talked about RollerCoaster Tycoon, one of the greatest PC games of all time. It was the pioneer for the Tycoon genre, which was different from, say, SimCity in that everything was hands-on and you had control of everything. Plus, you got to see how you impact people on an individual level. It's just so much more gratifying to build stuff when you get to see people interact with them and enjoy them. Doesn't hurt that you also get to kill them personally. So it should come as no surprise that Chris Sawyer would get to work on a sequel to capitalize on his new success, and once again in 2004. But would these sequels successfully iron out the rough patches of the original? Or would they fall short of its greatness? The answer is yes.
Imagination, imagination, a dream can be a dream come true.
So upon booting up the second game, the first thing you might notice is that it looks almost identical to the first game on a graphical level. That might strike some people as odd, since 3D games were already well in vogue even when the first game came out. Indeed, when the game was first released, it was generally criticized for being more of a RollerCoaster Tycoon 1.5, or an expansion or something. I personally don't mind for a few reasons. First, part of what made the first game so special is that the programming was so efficient it could run on pretty much anything, so building on the same engine made the most logical sense. After all, programming in assembly is nightmarishly difficult, so might as well get your money's worth. Second, the visual style I just find very appealing. I barely touched on this last time, but the isometric 2D view looks great, even by today's standards. And the third reason is that rather than greatly expand on the formula, the second game instead took it upon itself to refine everything about the first game that didn't work. For example, block breaks were added as a subtle yet incredibly important addition to coaster building. Now, in real life, block sections are sections of track that can only be occupied by one train at a time, and will stop any train at the end of it if the next train hasn't cleared the next section yet. This is done to prevent coaster trains from colliding into each other. While it's tricky to get the hang of it in the game, using these block sections greatly increases the throughput of these rides and, as such, your profit. Plus, it reduces the risk of a collision. You can also raise or lower rides as you construct them, allowing you to build rides completely underground or in the air if you want. There are more quality of life improvements as well, like being able to demolish scenery automatically by building into them. You can save your track designs to be copied into other parks, and most relieving of all, handymen no longer mow lawns by default. In addition to the refinements made to the formula, there's loads of new toys to play with. There are new coaster types like the freakishly tall and fast Giga Coaster, the intense and flexible Launch Coaster, the compact and practical Spiral Coaster, the impossible to build and only there because it looks cool multi-dimensional coaster, the list goes on. But it's not just coasters the game adds, we've got all sorts of new rides, like the elevator! And it's not just the rides that got an upgrade. The scenery in the first game was underwhelming, but in the second game, they give you so many more options. You can honestly make some really cool stuff if you put your mind to it. And of course, we also got more kinds of shops to drain the money from your guests' wallets, like Subway sandwiches, sunglasses, iced tea, cookies, pretzels. Oh right, the pretzels. I've been dying to talk about the pretzels. Can we talk about the pretzels? In real life, most theme parks I've been to have those big ol' soft pretzels, which they either salt with those giant pieces that break your teeth, shaped like the head of a soulless corporate mascot, or cover in the objectively best kind of cheese. Parmesan cheese. The only cheese you can snort. My point is, big pretzels are freaking delicious. So naturally, in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, you can build pretzel stalls that sell... crispy pretzels? Crispy pretzels? Crispy pretzels? What? You mean like these tiny things? That's not a pretzel. This is a pretzel. Is this like a cultural difference between the US and the UK that I'm just unaware of? This is serious business, you guys. If I went to a theme park and they sold these bags of tiny crunchy pretzels, I'm gonna go home right then and there. My intense disdain for a single piece of flavor text aside, I love these new additions that really flesh out your park, but all of that pales in comparison to the single best new addition this game introduced. So how many times has this happened to you? You're just managing your park when you discover that some of your guests aren't going on anything because they're broke, so they just bum around your park, unable to do or buy anything, keeping your park full and wasting their time and, more importantly, your money. The ATM alleviates the problem completely, allowing your guests to withdraw however much they want from their inexplicably bottomless bank accounts. This all doesn't come without cost though. We did lose a few small things like the spinning trains on the mini coaster or the boost track on the looping coaster, but nothing especially major. The only really true downgrade in the game's mechanics is the way entrance fees work. In the first game, you can set whatever price you wanted for both the entrance and individual rides, but in the second game, you only have two options. You can either charge everything up front and make all the rides free, or you can make entry into the park free and charge for the rides. You can't do both. It's not really the biggest thing in the world, but they did neuter a central gameplay mechanic for seemingly no reason. That and charging up front is objectively worse in every way. You constantly have to build new things to increase guest turnaround, and you burn through money really quickly, and any profit dies off in 2 seconds and the scenarios that make you do it are way harder than they need to be. Speaking of scenarios, the first game's levels were really well made with interesting layouts, cool concepts, and challenging restrictions. In the second game, we have scenarios that are big and flat, big and this one's big and flat, but it's covered with trees. Oh, there are a couple that were clearly made by lazily spamming the mountain tool. Yeah, the scenarios in the second game are a massive downgrade from the first game. After the stellar level design in the first, it's shocking how much worse it is this time around, though admittedly there is a reason for that. While the first game was more of, well, a game, the second game was more tailored to be a simulation or a creative tool. Chris Sawyer took note of how many people would rather just have it be a simulated theme park, and the design of the second one clearly reflects that. Heck, they even added in a flexible scenario editor to make your own levels, so the downgrade in the level design is only a problem if you let it be. I get why the decision was made, but one of my favorite parts of the first game were the scenarios, so this is a little disappointing. Heck, you don't even progress through the game and unlock new parks anymore. All of them are available from the get-go, which means you really lose out on a feeling of progression. The second game does add one very cool thing to the table, though, and that's its real-life parks. Now, tie-ins to real parks are nothing new to the series. They've been a mainstay throughout. The first game had Alton Towers and Blackpool Pleasure Beach as extras, the third game introduced some rides from Hershey Park, but the second game takes the cake, including recreations of 5 different Six Flags parks. Like, this is such a really cool extra to have real-life rides like Colossus, Texas Giant, Nitro, and X in there, as well as the ability to play around in those real parks and see all the fun ways they danced around the DC Comics copyright. As cool as this is, they're more of a fun bonus than anything else. Not really part of the main game, but surely the expansions could add something, right? Yeah, the game received 2 expansion packs. You remember those, right? They were the things that came before DLC, back when game companies actually released full games and added extra content after the fact, instead of making you pay extra for stuff that should have been there in the first place. These expansions were called Wacky Worlds and Time Twister, and they were absolute garbage. Good Gandhi, these are lazy. You thought you were getting new rides? Too bad, just a bunch of lazy reskins of rides you already have, except now they look like something vaguely connected with another culture, like a boomerang, or a machine gun, or a soccer ball. Literally the only ride that's actually worthwhile is the Double Deck Carousel. Everything else is just a reskin that doesn't even bother to adhere to the same art style. I mean, I guess it is kinda funny to build a theme park on Alcatraz or take apart the Great Wall of China to build a roller coaster through it, but the new content is so uninspired and I could definitely live without it. But I guess I can't be too hard on something that was made after the fact and wasn't part of the main game. RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 does refine many of the mechanics in the first game to near perfection, but not only is it not as inspired as the original, but its design philosophy of being a tool first and a game second really kinda hurts it. But that doesn't stop it from being just as involved, customizable, flexible, and fun as the original. My final verdict? RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 is great. 8 out of 10. But remember what I said last time? The original versions of 1 and 2 aren't the best ways to play them. Allow me to introduce you to OpenRCT 2, a mod for the game that adds a ton of quality of life improvements, cheats, easier mod support, and all sorts of new features. It's totally free so long as you already own the game, which is on Steam for pretty cheap. And it can even read save data from the first game, meaning that this all applies to the first game as well. If you ask me, this mod is the definitive way to play the first two games. But if you're a goody two-shoes like me, or if you want to bring the game with you on the go, then allow me to introduce RollerCoaster Tycoon Classic for mobile devices. This was an official release that combines the first two games into one package, again, using all of the second game's mechanics. It honestly works really, really well. However, I should stress that this only applies to the mobile version. They ported this to Steam, and it was really lazily thrown together and poorly optimized for PC. I mean, for crying out loud, they just copy-pasted the mobile version and didn't even bother adding anything like, oh, I don't know, an exit button. Yeah, stick to the mobile version. But okay, for the second game, they wanted to refine what made the first one great and fix everything that needed to be broken before they really started expanding on the formula in significant ways. And thus it was that in 2004, they released RollerCoaster Tycoon 3. This time developed by Frontier, it's obvious that this one is trying to be more modern, from the updated 3D graphics to the less carnival-sounding music. We aren't confined to the pre-rendered isometric sprites this time around. We have 3 full dimensions to work with and a free camera to boot, which sounds really cool, but I'd argue that it's actually a downgrade from 2, for a couple reasons. First, this game was released in 2004, so they had to make some compromises to get 3D. So while you do have thousands of customers roaming the park at once, they all look like this. With a face of like 3 polygons and blank, soulless eyes, you'll want to keep them happy, not just to make a profit, but also to appease them enough that they don't devour your soul. Joke's on them, though. I don't have a soul. I sold it for a PS5. But the other reason I'm not fond of the 3D style is that they make the game feel really restrictive and stiff. Now, the gameplay itself hasn't changed much. It's more or less the same game as the first two, even if it feels weightier and heavier, if that makes any sense. But having to use a grid-based system feels so much more restricted when the rest of the game is free-form 3D. The only part of the game that isn't restricted by the grid system is terrain, and boy howdy do I hate the terrain. The terrain is completely freeform and malleable, which sounds really cool for a game from 2004, but the problem is that because the game still runs on a grid system, they interact really bizarrely with the terrain. You sometimes wind up with instances of not being able to connect paths despite the ground being completely level. So if you try to make a really cool mountain, you'd better be prepared to keep it around, because if you try and level it, you're gonna have a bad time using that plot of land afterwards. But aside from the terrain, there are other places where the game feels way more complicated than it needs to be. Take the shops, for example. In the first two games, each shop only sold one thing for convenience sake, and that made it really simple to price it. A drink stand just sells sodas, that's it. In the third, however, not only do shops have different products of different sizes that you have to price accordingly, but you also have different extras you can add, which means that it's way harder to keep track of what your guests will or won't pay for, so you just set the extras to customer choice because there doesn't seem to be any reason not to, and just leave the prices as is for simplicity's sake. And they inexplicably got rid of popcorn, but the pretzel stands still sell bags of crunchy pretzels. No, I am still not over that! Let's talk about something else before I burst a blood vessel again. The scenarios in this game take a step forward and a few steps back, in my opinion. Each level has 3 sets of goals based on the difficulty level, giving you more incentive to fine-tune your scenario park instead of immediately moving on to the next one. In addition, it returns to the RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 style of unlocking more levels as you go along, and scenarios even have some of their own unique mechanics, such as VIP guests. These are celebrities who you have to impress by catering to their unique tastes. VIP guests such as US President Clint Bushton, most well known for admitting he had sex with a woman even though he actually didn't. With all of that going for them, I have to admit, I actually think the scenarios are some of the worst in the series, for one simple reason. You can't lose them. In the first two games, in most if not all scenarios, you either had a time limit or the threat of park closure if you can't keep your park rating high enough. But in RollerCoaster Tycoon 3, the game basically goes,
"It's okay, Rocky. You go when you feel like it."
There's no sense of urgency, there's no challenge, since you can just have a mildly profitable park, turn on the fast forward button the game finally added, and just leave it running for a bit. It doesn't help that the rides you have to work with seem to have been chosen at complete random. And just to add insult to injury, you can't even kill your guests in this one. You can plow into them with a high-powered coaster, but they just get knocked aside like bowling pins, and you get up and cheer? What? Now you'd think that with all the complaining I've been doing about 3, that this game would be an absolute failure, right? But no, I actually think this game is well worth playing for one very simple reason. 3 games in, they finally added a full sandbox mode that gives you an empty plot of flat land, infinite money, and every ride and object in the game. You will spend 99% of your time in this mode. It doesn't hurt that the variety of rides and decorations is the most expansive it's ever been. Heck, 3 has the most options in the entire series before and after this game, with coasters ranging from series staples to weird coaster models that have only been once in real life. You have special effects, fireworks shows, and the freedom to go nuts since you don't have to worry about money. And since money is no object, you don't have to worry about micromanaging the shops or anything. And of course, you have the game's main selling point, the coaster cam, where you can hop into first-person view and ride your creations yourself. Heck, you can even import your saved ride designs from the first 2 games. And the expansions, they are such an improvement from the last game. First and foremost, you have Splashed, which lets you create water parks with swimming pools and water slides, and it adds a whole new layer to park customization. But you can't drown people in the wave pool, so what's even the point? I kid, of course. This expansion is freaking awesome. So here's the thing. I live in southern Nevada, where the only theme park for miles around is in a part of town where people get shot. But there's a water park like 5 minutes away from my house. I drive by it like every morning on my daily commute. So I'm a lot more familiar with water parks. The second expansion, Wild, is a lot less impressive. It's all about adding animal exhibits to your park, like Busch Gardens or Disney's Animal Busch Gardens. And it's not bad or anything, but Zoo Tycoon exists and is much better in terms of making animal exhibits. Luckily, the expansion also gives you a ton of new coasters to play with, so it gets a pass. But more than that, RollerCoaster Tycoon 3 is incredibly laid back. It doesn't burden you with time limits, the sandbox mode is the main attraction, and the game wants you to make a theme park you'd like to go to and gives you the tools to experience it yourself. But yeah, mixed feelings on the gameplay aside, I do think that the third game has its own distinct, unique identity and stands on its own for its great customization options. The emphasis is placed more on the roller coaster part of the title rather than the Tycoon part. Is it my favorite? No. But sometimes you don't want to micromanage every single aspect of your park and just ride rides for a bit. If you just want to make your very own dream park without having to worry about limitations and do so at your own pace, look no further. RollerCoaster Tycoon 3 is decent. 7 out of 10. And with that, we've covered the original trilogy. And even though they haven't all been equal in terms of quality, each one has something unique to bring to the table. Whether it's the creative and well-designed maps of the first game, the refined gameplay and expansive modding community of the second, or the laid-back freedom of the third. These are 3 games that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I'm glad I finally got to talk about them. But if you ask most fans of the genre, they'll tell you that the series ended with the third game. Join me next time when I explain why they are completely and utterly right.